This is a fascinating machine. What is it?
This is the Atavachron. I'm sure you'll find something here that pleases you.
This appears to be an archive or library of some kind.
You are listening to the Tricorder transmissions.
You may select from more than 20,000 various papers.
And now, here are Jeff and Claire.
The library serves no purpose unless someone is using it.
Hello again, and thanks for tuning in to episode 4 of the Atavachron series. Today, co-host Claire and I will be continuing our discussion of our world's influence on the final episode of the original series, Turnabout Intruder. And here we are, picking up on where we left off last time. Now, another point to explore, something that didn't happen in the episode, but if it had happened, what do you think would have been the result? So if they did have some sort of definitive proof that Lester was in Kirk's body and the transfer was permanent, they couldn't switch back. So Captain Kirk is now physically Janice Lester, but still the same guy, just in a woman's body. Would they have let him assume command of the Enterprise or retain command of the Enterprise as physically as a woman, knowing that it was him?
I would think so. I mean, I don't know. This might be me simplifying things simply because I see this as a simple issue. But that's just like saying, well, what if Captain Kirk, got a bionic leg or something? Like physically he's different.
Mm-hmm.
But as long as he's still physically capable, his bionic leg works and he's, mobile and all of that. If he's still basically able to pass his Starfleet physicals, yeah, I don't see what's different about it. But I realize that I'm kind of speaking from the position of someone who'd be like, of course I ought to be able to be the captain just because I'm a woman. So I'm not really, I'm biased is what I'm saying.
Of course. Well, couldn't you, for the sake of argument, let me preface this by saying that
if they have to do like 30 pull-ups or climb one of those gym ropes, Janice Lester's body might not be able to do that.
Maybe not, but I could see, and this is not my personal opinion, but I could see somebody in Starfleet Command raising the question, well, would the body chemistry of the female body have an effect on Kirk's mental state? The different hormone levels, would he not be himself anymore because of the chemical composition of her body? Because he's a male, he's used to a certain, like, look at when they separated the two Kirks in The Enemy Within, right? You had the one more emotional Kirk, and would he eventually start to change his personality because of the body he was now in?
That's a really interesting question and a really interesting point. And I have a feeling, especially if you were to be talking to doctors from 1969, they would probably say that, being in Janet Lester's body would permanently and negatively affect Captain Kirk's mentality or persona or whatever we want to call it. I'm sure that if you look at the medical literature from the 40s and 50s, there's probably like genuine scientific studies that prove that, women are really bad under stress, or, they are easily flustered or whatever silly thing. And it's because of their delicate constitution. I mean, I know that in Victorian times that was deemed to be scientifically truthful. And it was because of their physical bodies. And, and it's frankly, it's something that you see not just about women, but you see medical literature for any group of people that needs to be told they can't do something. If you can find a so-called medical or scientific reason for it, then all of a sudden it's sort of foolproof for a time. I mean, look at silly things like phrenology that have nothing to do with race or gender, and just like your head shape. That the shape of your head really does not have any bearing on whether or not you'll make a good mathematician or a good doctor or a good mechanic. But for a time, they thought it really did. Looking at race, there were plenty of so-called scientific studies that, supposedly proved that certain races were either superior or inferior to others based on medical science as it was used at the time. And it's preposterous, of course, but it was also sort of, it followed the rules. There's a, if you can trot out medical science or any sort of any authoritative body that's taken, whose word is taken to be very important and learned, you can have them say pretty much anything. And some people are going to believe it simply because it comes out of the mouth of authority. And
Absolutely.
so, yeah, I could totally see somebody claiming that Janice Lester's body would taint Captain Kirk's command ability somehow. He'd get PMS, and then, like the Enterprise would spontaneously explode.
Exactly.
That's totally what would happen.
Well, I think that the societally accepted physical inferiority of women is directly referenced during that court-martial scene.
It is.
When the actual transference is brought up, and there was the reference to Dr. Lester committing a violent act against Kirk is mentioned, there's an audible laugh, and you actually see people in the gallery laughing at the concept of a woman physically besting a man, which we know is easily possible. But back then it was always believed, I guess it was a common belief, that there was no way this woman could have possibly physically bested Captain Kirk.
Well, and the person who is most obsessed with that idea is Janice Lester herself.
Mm-hmm.
She repeatedly states that she's, so physically inferior because she's a woman. I think she's really talking about strength, but, and she also, in the beginning of the episode, has this really bizarre statement to Kirk that, like, he should have killed her. But this is something she says right after the transfer. Kirk, you should have killed me while you had the chance, but, you wouldn't do it even though you had this strong body of yours. Like, she not only thinks that women are physically weak, but that men are these like killing machine, they have these like bodies that are made for nothing but being strong and killing people and being physically dominant. It's a very weird thing that she's got going on there.
Yeah, and what desire would Kirk have had to kill her at that point?
None. It's a really weird thought all the way around. And another thing that's interesting is that near the end of the episode, right before Lester and Kirk switch back into their own bodies, you see Captain Kirk in Janice Lester's body putting up a physical fight against a guard, and doing a pretty okay job at it. I mean, she's not doing any of her like trademark Captain Kirk karate chopping or two-legged kick things or anything like that, but she's, she doesn't immediately fall to the ground. She's not a damsel in distress. She's fighting back. Janet Lester's body is capable of doing that when it's inhabited by a mind that just thinks it can do that. The second Janet Lester goes back into her regular body, she gets all weak and floppy and stops fight and is no longer capable of putting up a fight.
And apparently devolves almost into a childlike state.
Yeah.
Throwing a temper tantrum, which I thought was very bizarre and very contrary to her. I mean, some of her more irrational actions during the episode didn't give me any indication. I would have fully expected when she went back into her other body that she would just be kicking and screaming with revenge and anger, and not crying and breaking down and almost falling on the floor and having to be dragged away.
Yes, it's very strange. It's like every possible, like, kind of unpleasant stereotype for the way a woman would be really emotional gets checked off in this episode. One of them being that, you just devolve into a child. It's not that I certainly was not rooting for Janice Lester. She's clearly a crazy person and, she should be carted away somewhere. So it's not like I wanted her to like succeed in her revenge attempt or anything, but she could have maintained a shred of dignity, but I guess, there's the indignity of being a woman. So she was stuck being extremely undignified. I don't know.
It absolutely true. For all the stereotypical check marks that they gave the Lester character in this episode, we've listed a whole bunch of them already. There's one typically statistically male characteristic that they gave her, which to me is a real head scratcher. They made her a mass murderer. If you look at statistics, most serial killers or mass murderers, the vast majority are males.
And when they're female serial killers, they're almost always mercy killers, and it's usually of children. Exactly. And in this case, she killed a whole bunch of people who were adults, and it was a purely calculated move. There was no That's true. That is interesting. I had not thought about that.
Very strange
Huh.
choice. I mean, they could have easily come up with any
Yeah.
millions of numbers of possibilities and stories of how she lured Kirk there. You know, they
Yeah.
didn't need to have her be a mass murderer. You know, it would have been easy. I mean, we could probably come up with 10 variations right now.
Well,
That
and
would
they
be perfectly
even,
believable.
yeah, and the sort of gender flip continues one step further, which is she, as a mass murderer, has a man who's in love with her, just sort of
Mm-hmm.
unflaggingly devoted to her. That is something that, again, and I don't know if the real statistics play out on this, but it's at least portrayed this way, sort of in general pop culture. It's usually women who are like obsessing over murderers in prison.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you always hear about this, like women who fall in love with people while they're in guys while they're in prison for murder, and you don't generally hear, maybe just because there aren't a lot of female mass murderers,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't usually hear about men writing letters to female murderers while they're in prison.
Exactly. So that kind of stood out to me as a head scratcher.
Yeah.
Yeah.
One thing I noticed while watching this episode, and I don't know if this was intentional direction or if it was just Leonard Nimoy as a person just sort of reacting a certain way while he was acting, but right after Spock realizes that Kirk is inside Janice Lester's body, as they're leaving sickbay, there's a scuffle. They get sort of stopped while they're in the doorway by some security guards, and you see Spock actually grab Janice Lester's hand
Yes.
in a protective gesture. And I would love to know if that was intentional direction or if that was just sort of instinctive, man protecting woman. I really would love to know what that was all about. I mean, I actually had to run it back because I saw that he put his arm out, but I wasn't sure if he grabbed her hand, and he did very briefly, and then he lets it go and does the rest of the action in the scene. But I thought that was really interesting because obviously he would never grab Captain Kirk's hand while Captain Kirk was
No.
in his own body. He may have protected him physically in some other way, but put his arm out, at chest level or something. But I really don't think he would have grabbed Kirk's hand.
No. I wonder. I don't have a. There's no copies of the script that I've ever seen for this. I'm sure they exist somewhere, but I wonder if that was in the script or if that was something that Nimoy did on his own.
Yeah, and if Nimoy did it on his own, again, was it an intentional,
Yeah.
like this would be an interesting layer, or was it just like Leonard Nimoy, if this had happened while the cameras were not rolling, that would have been his instinct to protect just the person behind him, the woman behind him. I don't know. I just thought it was very fascinating.
It is, and I noticed the same thing. Very interesting. And well,
Yeah.
the contact between Spock and Kirk in Lester's body in that small little cell
Yeah.
seemed very close. You know, it almost seemed a little awkward at times, especially
Yeah.
during the mind meld part.
Yeah, you could tell. I can't recall who directed this, but you could tell that if that scene had been directed for Spock and a character who was both mentally and physically female, they would have been. I mean, they even played like the mysterious Spock music cue, which is usually saved for Spock being mysterious in a way that is like
Yep.
the average female viewer would enjoy. So they actually used that musical cue, which I think was originated for Amok Time, when he's sort of flirting with Nurse Chapel. So that's an interesting musical cue to choose there.
Yeah, it's a very spooky cue.
It's the bass
yeah, that
music. Yeah, it's
yeah.
a great musical cue, but
It is.
it is sort of usually reserved for when Spock is being seductive, or like mysteriously Vulcan, which
Yeah.
equals seductive. That's kind of what I mean.
Yeah.
Spock is rarely actually seductive, but so they use that cue. But yes, they also, I think they kind of just were like, Spock is mind melding with a woman. Okay, great. Get his face really close. I mean, to be fair, Spock has gotten pretty intimate with other men while mind melding with them sometimes. And frankly, there are scenes throughout the entire series where I don't know if it's because the sets were confined or men just got a lot closer to each other back in the 1960s. I don't know. There are plenty of times throughout the show where I'm like, wow, those guys are really close to each other. Like, and they don't need to be. But yeah, it was definitely interesting. I mean, there's a whole other side of this episode that we haven't even talked about because I don't think I'm qualified. Just in terms of, looking at the transgender aspects of it, not in terms of gender politics, but just in terms of, the experiences of, not only being in a body that's not yours, but that's not your gender. And then also the way you're perceived by the other people around you change, how and if that changes when they know that you're not in your right body or your right gendered body. There's like a whole other piece of this we could talk about that I think somebody else would be better qualified to talk about.
Yeah, I think so. But also the actors' choices in portraying somebody of the opposite sex inhabiting their body. I mean, Shatner, I think, does a much more exaggerated portrayal than
I got to give him a little bit of credit, though. He gets really hammy. He kind of purses his lips a lot. And I mean, when they show him filing his nails, that's like amazing. But he doesn't get, he could have gone a lot further with it, especially given the fact that it was the 1960s. He could have played an extremely effeminate, insultingly sort of stereotypical sort of gay guy wrist. All this, he could have gone
flamboyant
much further down the road than he did. And I have to give him credit for that, and the direction credit for not asking him to go that far. Because not only would that have, it just would have been distracting from an acting standpoint, but it would have been unpleasant and just untrue. I'm glad that he did not go as far as he probably could have gotten away with going on 1960s television.
The audience consideration as well. What would fly with the audience and what wouldn't? What level could he go to without it being a real turnoff to the audience?
Since when has that ever stopped William Shatner?
That's true. Well, he may have gotten some other direction if he had gone a little too far, or the network may have stepped in and, like, with the with the Plato stepchildren controversy, the network could have jumped in and said, we don't think this is appropriate.
And of course, they don't ever have, sexuality is not addressed whatsoever or even hinted at. And I don't mean sexual orientation, but I just mean either character. The only time that I'm like, maybe it's there is when Kirk kind of gives eyes to Nurse Chapel when he's trying to get her to leave. I'm not sure. I think that was just Kirk being charming, generically charming. What?
Wait a minute. I know. I just said he. No, there is one. There is one scene that I think there is some very strange sexual tension, and that is a later scene with Janice Lester in Kirk's body and that last confrontation with Dr. Coleman, where, he comes up behind Coleman and grabs him and is kind of whispering in his ear about, we're both going to be murderers if we're found out. And he's playing that love angle. Like, I know you're in love with me, and now I'm in a man's body. Now you really have no chance with me. Well, in Coleman, for Coleman, it would be a homosexual relationship, but for Janice, it would be a heterosexual relationship, but in a man's body. A very weird dynamic.
Well, and if Coleman in love with Janice Lester's person, her mind, then this, and again, this is where I think like we could have like a panel discussion with a bunch of different people on it. That would be awesome. Where would it actually be a homosexual relationship for him? The person that he fell in love with is a woman. And if it's just her body that he's in love with, it's not, because, then he'd fall in love with like a blow up doll or something. It's her person, including her body, but not exclusively her body. So while she's in a male body, if he's still in love with the person in that body, it anatomically, I suppose it would be a homosexual relationship, but I don't know. It wouldn't be like he suddenly is attracted to and loves men. He loves the person that happens to be in this male body.
True, but could he separate those two?
I don't know. And that's where I think I don't know. And I think the answer to that would be different for different people.
Yeah, definitely. That could warrant an entire panel discussion.
It totally could.
Yeah. So maybe we should hold off on that.
And then we can talk about Dax and the Trills and their whole... I really want to talk about that anyway.
Okay. So we'll lump all that stuff together.
Yeah. But what's interesting is I did not see that scene that you're referring to as sexual or even like the love angle. I got that she was referencing their the fact that he's in love with her and is an accomplice, but I didn't see Kirk's physical or William Shatner's physical, his acting as physically expressive of sexuality. That's really, I'm not saying it wasn't. It's just sort of interesting to me that I didn't see it. That's kind of what I'm more amazed by.
If you go back and just watch that scene again, there's that one moment where Lester and Kirk's body is pressed up against the Coleman from behind. It has his hands grasping Coleman while he's talking into Coleman's ear, and it seemed like he was using a physical contact to try to rekindle Coleman's feelings or intensify Coleman's feelings.
Yeah.
For Lester, and for her, that would seem like a normal thing. And Coleman didn't seem to have a weird reaction to it at all.
No. I mean, he must have been obviously they planned this thing. It was very elaborately planned. Mm-hmm. So at the very end of the episode, he's like, "Oh, you are as I loved you." He's very glad that Janice Lester's mind is back in Janice Lester's body. But I never get the impression that he's repulsed by Janice Lester and Kirk's body. He's kind of unsure of her decision making. You can see that he's hesitant in that respect, but it never seems like a physical thing. And obviously, he must know that, like, if this plan is going to succeed or to be successful, this plan has to be permanent. Like, the change has to be permanent. So he must have been okay with it to a certain extent. Maybe not, it wasn't ideal. He would prefer her in her original body, but I guess he was maybe expecting that it would never be a sexual relationship, but it would simply be that he could be around her. She would be happy. That's how much he loves her, is that this thing that dramatically changes her in his eyes makes her happy, and therefore he's happy, I guess.
Yeah, a little codependent, but okay.
Oh, totally. Well, so is she. I mean, her entire life is based around getting revenge with Kirk. And by the way, she does to her admirer exactly what she thinks Kirk did to her. Totally drops him, uses him, drops him, whatever. Whether Kirk actually was mean to her in the academy, we don't know. The number of women, I was trying to figure out how many years Kirk must have been at Starfleet Academy for him to date. He has 4 or 5 different women that were his girl at Starfleet Academy at this point. So he must have gotten held back anyway. Or they were dating him at the same time and didn't know it. But anyway, yeah, she ends up committing the same sort of slight to her admirer that she thinks Kirk has done to her, which is sort of interesting.
Yeah, it was a little hypocritical on her part.
It is. I mean, she is clearly a crazy person. So yeah. Well, I think we've covered pretty much everything I've got notes for.
I've got a couple more things if you're interested. Okay. So, talking about women in command, and we've established the fact that Enterprise had retconned that women were able to be in command, although we didn't see any of that in the original series. But I realized while I was thinking about some of the things I wanted to bring up for this conversation that while we didn't see a yellow shirt female in charge of a starship in the original series, we did see a female captaining a starship in the original series.
I'm thinking.
It's a trick question.
A starship in the original series.
It's a trick question.
If it's in the animated series, I'm going to laugh because I haven't seen it. Oh, okay.
It's not.
That would have been a good trick. Well, I mean, and you don't mean Janice Lester and Captain Kirk's body, right? No. Okay. Well, I do believe that Uhura sits in the chair.
Nope.
No?
Nope. Full-fledged starship captain.
Oh, the Romulan commander.
There you go.
Yeah. Okay.
So the Romulans have female starship captains.
Oh, yeah.
But Starfleet does not.
Yes. Which is actually totally in keeping. If the Romulans are the Russians, it totally works because that was one thing, especially in terms of propaganda and publicly, Valentina Tereshkova, I believe is her last name, was the first female astronaut who went up in the early 1960s. Russia, the USSR was really big on promoting this whole like, well, if America is so great, how come they won't let women do things and we'll let women do things, equality of the sexes. That said, it was kind of a hollow conceit because they didn't have another female astronaut or cosmonaut go up for another 20 years. So it's not like they were regularly shooting women into space. They just did the one for a while. But yes, that is true. And it's interesting.
Juxtapose that with some of the females that had semi-positions or authoritative positions, at least in their fields, in Starfleet, who were portrayed as easily corruptible or untrustworthy. So people like MacGyver's
yes,
from Space Seed, who was prominent in her field as a historian, and she's easily swayed by Khan. How about Palamas from Who Mourns for Adonis? So falls in love with Apollo and betrays her crew. Interesting the way that important female Starfleet characters are portrayed in such a way, but the Romulans have a very prominent female in a lead role, and she's a very strong character who also falls prey to a romantic ruse, but still, she's still a very strong leader.
She is, and it's I don't know if it's intentional. I keep saying that over and over again. I'm not trying to be like an apologist, but I mean, part of me just doesn't want Star Trek to have. I want Star Trek to be perfect,
of course.
But the fact that many of the women shown in sort of important roles in Starfleet, not all, of course, but yeah, you mentioned two kind of prominent examples. The fact that they're easily swayed, they're either completely untrustworthy by the end, or nearly so, in the case of Marla McGivers, or just sort of frivolous and easily distracted. That does seem to be some commentary on whether or not it's appropriate to have women in a position of authority where if they are distracted or they don't perform their duties well, is it going to put a bunch of people's lives at risk?
So since our show is based around the real world touching Star Trek and influencing Star Trek, I think since we're on the topic of sexual inequality, I think it would be appropriate to mention the real world inequality that reared its head behind the scenes of the show. 3 of the major female recurring characters on the original series were all victims of bias and inequality. I mean, starting with Majel, who we mentioned earlier, who had a high level position in the original pilot in the network, being that she was in a relationship with Roddenberry. I mean, this is hearsay, but this is generally the accepted reason that they felt that she only had that role because she was in a relationship with Gene Roddenberry, and cast her out from that role and said that the character had to be eliminated.
Not only that, but my understanding is that during screenings of the original pilot, The Cage, there was a strong negative reaction to the character of number 1 being this extremely logical, basically Spock in Majel Barrett's body, and that a large majority of the negative reaction was from female viewers who felt that she was icy and cold. And I've read it in several places, that she was icy and cold and unpleasant and just off-putting, basically, to a lot of the female viewers, which is, I think, very, very interesting. And, again, sort of speaks to the times in that she was an unusual character for a woman, an unusual portrayal of a woman. And to some women, that may have been intimidating or genuinely unpleasant. They may really just have not liked that concept of a woman.
True. And it was probably intimidating to many of the men, too.
Right. She was not maternal. She was not warm. She was not what you expect out of a female character at that time.
The most unfortunate of the 3 being Grace Lee Whitney. And there are several things that unfortunately she had to bear during her time on the original series. And, the body image pressure, to keep up her appearances and to fit in the small uniform, wound up getting her into amphetamines and diet pills so that she could keep her trim figure. And, of course, allegedly sexually assaulted by a network executive and then summarily dismissed several days after.
Yes.
definitely a victim of gender bias, in my opinion.
Well, and her character even, as an actress, she's playing a character who twice off the top of my head is sexually assaulted to varying degrees.
On screen.
Yeah. I mean, it was like an important plot point. I would think for an actress that would be, and maybe that didn't bother her. Maybe she was perfectly fine with it. I don't know. And I'm not saying she should have been bothered by it, but it is potentially something that, if as an actress you sort of like, oh, another one of those stories. Okay, I've got to act this traumatic event, and one that she would apparently later experience herself in real life. I don't know. It's interesting that sexually assaulting someone was considered a completely okay way to move the plot of an episode forward. That maybe there could have been other ways to do it, but for whatever reason, that was the way they chose, and it's certainly not exclusive to Star Trek in any way, shape, or form. It happens all the time. There are a lot of lazy plot devices out there, and unfortunately, crime or specifically sexual assault seems to be in certain genres of TV a really common one.
Yeah, I thinking back on our commentary track a couple of years ago on The Enemy Within, I remember Craig and I talked at length on that commentary about how I think both of us agreed that sexual assault moment was probably the worst or most awkward Captain Kirk moment of the entire series, and we both questioned the reasoning for even having it in there.
Yeah,
it seems so unnecessary and gratuitous.
And the thing that strikes me the most about that episode is how quickly Yeoman Rand is expected to sort of just say, "Oh well, all's forgiven."
Exactly.
You weren't you at the moment. Well, that's what you could say about someone who tries to do that while they're drunk.
Yeah, well, he was himself, but only half of himself.
Exactly.
Right?
And it's that, well, he wasn't in his right mind. Again, it's that, well, he wasn't responsible for his actions because of something. And while Kirk certainly didn't intend to be split in two by the transporter beam, so that was not intentional. Again, this idea that she, partially because it's episodic television, and you see this all the time throughout Star Trek for other issues where characters like have about 30 seconds at the end of an episode to deal with a very traumatic event of some sort, and then they like never mention it again. So this happens a lot, but it seems, especially when it's your captain, it's a person who is in a strong position of authority, obviously. And you've seen them in a certain light and they've done something to you, and you're supposed to just sort of go, well, it was another wacky adventure on the Enterprise where weird stuff happens. And she just has to like be okay with it. That is the weirdest part of that episode, in my opinion.
The fact of the matter is that nothing was added to Kirk when he split. It was all of Kirk just split into two parts. So that inner rapist, if you will, is part of Captain Kirk normally. It has to be. So that's the part. So, even if she were to say, well, I guess it's okay, you weren't yourself, but he was himself. It was half of himself. So that part of him, it's still the same guy. So that part of him is still there even when he's put back together.
Yeah. And if the argument is simply that, well, that half of him didn't have any inhibitions, that, it was kind of the lizard brain half of Kirk, they could have shown him being completely, having no inhibition in another way. That could have been him. I mean, this would not have been as dramatic, or maybe it would, I'm sure a writer would say, well, there's a reason we didn't choose this one, but they could just show him eating 5 gallons of ice cream or whatever. I realize that's kind of goofy, but just something else where he doesn't have self-control. It's whatever he wants, he's going to do. And so I think that's what they were trying to portray, but they could have done it differently. They could have gotten, and I think without that thing, and I know they need the scratch on the cheek. Okay, that's how they tell the difference between them. Again, there are other ways they could have gone about that.
Yeah, well, they could have had him get into a fight with a male crew member.
Right. Yeah, and it could
somebody could have been disrespectful to him or disobeyed an order, and he took a swing at him and whatever. Right.
Yeah, he could have been impulsive about something else. And
absolutely.
So. And again, if it's about impulse control, it is a little alarming to know that there's just this like layer, this like veneer of civility on top of Kirk's like rutting interior.
Yeah. Yeah, on both counts, I would prefer if that hadn't have happened for Rand's sake and for Kirk's sake.
Yeah, it's yeah, I agree.
So that leaves Nichelle Nichols, who was a victim of income inequality. So, and thankfully, when it was exposed that she was getting paid less than both Walter Koenig and George Takei, that Nimoy stepped up and fought for her and wound up getting her equal pay for equal work. So that's still a huge problem today. And and it happened again when they cast for the animated series. They originally weren't going to bring her back, and again Nimoy stepped up and refused to do his part unless they brought her in. So it's a shame that stuff had to happen behind the scenes, and of course, like I was saying, income inequality is still a hot topic.
Yeah.
Today in 2015, it's a shame that we haven't gotten over this yet.
Well, and yeah, I mean, in a way, that kind of harkens back to the question you asked earlier, which is, if the switch between Janet Lester and Captain Kirk had been permanent, would they have allowed Captain Kirk in Janet Lester's body to continue to be the captain? And Kirk in Janet Lester's body is exactly as qualified to be the captain of the Enterprise as Captain Kirk in Captain Kirk's body, in terms of his experience, his training, his education, his camaraderie with his crew, his captain's instincts. Everything that makes Captain Kirk capable and qualified in a male body exists in him in a woman's body. This kind of slips back into the whole pay equality thing, which is, if a person is just as qualified on paper and in terms of their life experiences and their skills and their capabilities, it shouldn't make a difference which bathroom they go into.
Yeah.
But again, that's not the perception that everybody has. And so that's kind of where the challenge is. The fact that it is a question. In fact, I think during the court-martial, Janet Lester sort of taunts Captain Kirk in Janet Lester's body and says that she wouldn't be allowed to serve as the captain again, or finally.
So, Claire, I think we spent a lot of time on this episode, talking about some of the ways that, women are poorly represented in Star Trek, or some of the stereotypes that made it into Star Trek. So I'd like to actually kind of try to do a little more positive
absolutely,
ending
yes,
to this. If you would be so, if you would indulge me in this, I think it would be a good idea to maybe talk about some of the great female roles that existed in Star Trek. And I know we've already talked about there weren't that many of them, or, the Starfleet, females in Starfleet were often portrayed poorly. And, there were obviously many female characters on Star Trek who were introduced specifically for love interests for Captain Kirk. But there are a good handful, I think, of great female roles in the original series. And do you have any that leap to the top of your list that you want to throw out there?
Yeah. I'm glad that you want to end on a positive note, because I was going to suggest this if you didn't. I think that Star Trek as a whole franchise clearly made enormous efforts in terms of creating really strong female characters, whether they're in positions of authority or not, and treating those characters with a lot of respect. I mean, at some point in The Next Generation, there are almost a disproportionate number of female admirals. At some point, every admiral is a woman, which is sort of interesting. But talking about the original series, I have to go with Elizabeth Denner in Where No Man Has Gone Before. I just really love this episode. It's one of my absolute favorites. But I think she's portrayed as a very, yes, she's swayed by the power. In some respects, she's kind of stereotypically feminine in terms of the way the original series would portray female characters. But ultimately, she's able to control her feelings, and she does the right thing. And so much so that she sacrifices herself in order to do the right thing. And I think, she is a very attractive woman, and she is seen sort of as a love interest in certain ways. But she also is pretty strong in the face of Gary Mitchell flirting with her kind of inappropriately. She blows him off at first.
Mhm.
And those silver eyes. I mean, who can resist the silver eyes?
Not
No.
you.
I like to think I would also do the right thing in the end, but I really don't know. But and also, I think it's quite interesting. Number one, also she's wearing pants. She's one of the very
Yes.
few women in a Starfleet uniform wearing pants. So I have to give her huge credit for that. Although interestingly enough, I read that the actress was really uncomfortable with how tight those pants were. And so if you watch
Mm.
the episode carefully, you'll see that her character is always has her hands kind of in front of her crotch. And it's because she was really uncomfortable with how tight the pants were, which they don't look tight to me at all. Times change, I guess. But yeah, that was my first thought in terms of a strong female character. Also, and I've blanked on the name of both the character and the episode. Oh my God, you put me on the spot. Shoot. The first character that Diana Muldaur plays, not the woman in, not the ambassador in Is There in Truth No Beauty, but the other episode. She's also a pretty awesome character.
Oh, why is this escaping me now?
She's like this no-nonsense female, I think she's a doctor, again, or a scientist of some sort. Anyway, she is a totally capable woman who's not portrayed as a love interest herself. I mean, she ends up taking on, again, it's another episode where people's bodies are inhabited by someone else's mind. But she herself, Return of the Archons. Yes, that. And I can't remember her character's name, but I was always really impressed with her performance in that. And again, her character, she makes some very important decisions in that episode, and Kirk and Spock go along with her decisions. They trust her expertise. And she makes some pretty brave decisions too.
Excellent picks.
Thank you.
For being on the spot. Excellent
Crap.
picks. And I actually had Elizabeth Dana on my short list, but I think if I had to go through and pick an absolute favorite female character, I'm kind of leaning towards Vana from the Cloudminders. So she was the leader of the Troglodytes, or one of the authoritative figures of the Troglodytes, who is a freedom fighter essentially. She's brave, very intelligent, standing up for what she believes in, standing up for her people, and affecting change in a very difficult and heavily biased world, where her people were enslaved. And granted, she does attempt to kill Captain Kirk, but then again, who doesn't attempt to kill Captain Kirk at some point or another? But I love that the character didn't use sexuality to try to influence anybody, as a lot of other female characters in Star Trek did. She used her brains, and I just really loved what they did with that character. And it was, what makes it even more interesting is they kind of have a Droxine in that episode is almost the opposite. She's more of a follower, very biased, although she does come around at the end.
Yes.
But you kind of have a counterbalance there. So I really always enjoyed that Vana character. And I know the Cloudminders kind of is one of those episodes that people are a little bit more down on, but it was always one of the ones that I really enjoyed.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting because Droxine ends up sort of seducing Spock. It's like someone has to get seduced at some point in every single Star Trek episode, whoever's doing what. And since Kirk was not available because he was, his characters was sort of acting against this woman who wasn't using her sexuality. It's like, well, we've got Spock left over. Spock's gonna have
Might
to,
as well.
yeah, even though it's completely out of character, go with it.
And I feel that I would be remiss, and I don't know if this is accepted or as a strong female role, but I kind of felt like, actually, from our show's namesake episode, I thought the Zarabeth character was physically and mentally a very strong character. I mean, she's been exiled. She's living by herself in a frozen tundra and has found a way to survive and, create a shelter for herself and get by. And she's not, she's not angry. She's not bitter. She's not, she's accepted her fate and she's surviving.
I would totally agree with that. And she doesn't throw herself at Spock, even though they do end up having a relationship. She's, yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I'm glad you mentioned her. And the actress did a really nice job of playing her very
Wonderful.
kind of, it was a very subtle performance.
And I love the fact that you don't see female characters in the original series as physically strong characters a lot of the time. So Vanna had that skill. She was a fighter.
Yeah.
And I like the fact that Zarabeth was able to have that quality.
Absolutely. Yes.
I guess we can also just mention old Edith Keeler.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I know.
I always loved the Edith Keeler character.
Yeah.
She was in a leadership role. You know, she was the leader. She led that shelter.
Oh, yeah.
You know, she was charitable and highly intelligent, visionary.
Definitely.
Great example of a female character.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So a little positive note there to end on.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, Star Trek, for all of its faults, I think that there still was a lot of good representations of women.
Oh, absolutely. And I just want to clarify, you know, I wanted to talk about this episode not to bash it or denigrate it or criticize it, but I think it's just a really fascinating episode. And some of the reasons that it's fascinating are sort of unfortunate, but not all. And I enjoy watching it. Maybe not for the reasons that the writer had in mind, but I certainly enjoy it. It's a really thought-provoking episode.
Oh, I do too. I've always enjoyed this episode, and you know, Craig and I, when we did it on our commentary, we both had differing opinions, and he doesn't enjoy this as much as I do. But I always love Captain Kirk or William Shatner getting to play a little bit of a different Captain Kirk. So it always amuses me to see. That's why I love episodes like The Enemy Within, where he gets to play two different Captain Kirks, and Mirror Mirror, where you get to see him being an evil Kirk. So I always love Shatner has such a great way of being his character, but being able to play it in such a way that you know it's a different person playing that character, if you know
Absolutely.
what I mean.
Yeah, you are never confused or unsure during Turnabout Intruder as to whether or not the person in Captain Kirk's body is Captain Kirk or Janice Lester. You are never unsure. It's always obvious that it's Janice Lester in there.
Yes, exactly. So, all right, Claire, this has been a great episode. I think this is our longest episode to date.
Oh my God.
Yeah, we went on quite a while, but it's always great to sit down and talk with you. So, I guess now that we're closing up the show, I guess we can let the audience know that due to some personal commitments and things during the holiday season, that the show, the Atavachron show, is going to go on hiatus for a little bit. Looking to fire up again right after New Year 2016. So sorry, guys and listeners out there.
Well, and thank you everyone for listening. We just wanted to give you guys a little extra time to listen to this particularly long episode as well.
Nice. So you have a few months to listen to it, but we will be back.
Yes.
I guess that about wraps it up. And Claire, where can people find you on the internet if they're looking to talk to you during our hiatus?
Yeah, I am on Twitter. My handle is IsoLinearChick. So that's ISOLINEARCHICK.
All right. And as always, I'm on the Tricorder Transmissions Facebook page, also Twitter, TTT_pod. And my personal Twitter is J_BENJ. So J_Benj. So fire off anything you want to say, and I'll be more than happy to get back to you. So we will see you on our next normal episode of the Tricorder Transmissions.
Yes, thanks for listening.